an attacker might create a persistent backdoor. And what we're going to talk about is how they're doing it, the indicators, how we can detect that, and then I'm going to show you a tool that will facilitate that in an easier way. So before I begin, a little bit about myself. My name is Andy Thompson. I am a national manager for CyberArk software. I have a really cool job where I'm not a sales guy. I'm simply just a guy that helps the customer. With the way they look at it is happy customers buy more stuff. So my job is simply just to help people wherever. So whether it's in support, or whether it's writing white papers, or helping with customers, or speaking at events or conferences, it's a cool gig. So anyway, I have a degree from UTA from Management Information Systems. Our football team is undefeated since '76. Go Mavs! If you're familiar with the UTA, we haven't had a team since '76. So also, thanks to DHA in particular in the InfoSec community here in Dallas, these guys prompted me to go in and take a bunch of certifications to skill up. And so I grabbed a couple of them. Those are listed here. Also, I'm married. I have 2 kids at home that are 8 and 10, awesome kids. I'm also a road warrior. I spend a lot of time on the road in hotels. I like to say home is where the Wi-Fi is. And lastly, I'm known in the DHA InfoSec community here as like the travel hacker. My job allows me to accrue a ton of frequent flyer points. And so me and my family travel all over the world for like pennies. We just got back from Tahiti, Moorea, and Bora Bora for like $3,500 for the 4 of us. So you want to learn more about that? I'll talk to you guys about that some other time. All right, so let's keep going here. Come on. All right, so before I begin, I want to make this known that this talk would not be possible because I don't know this stuff. I'm not the intelligent person here. This whole talk was built on the work of some amazing people. Tim Medine, Will Shorter, the guys at Spectre Labs. All this work is really we got to give credit where credit's due. Okay. So with that said, I want to also give props to the people at our CyberArk labs that actually developed these scans. And so again, I didn't create any of this. I'm just sharing this with you guys as a community here. So let's get started from an agenda perspective. We're going to talk about hidden risks. We talked about a little bit earlier about what those hidden risks are. So an attacker gets into an organization. They want to stay there. So you can either stay there with the same username and password you got in there, or create some sort of way of persistence so you can always stay have a hook in the organization. And these are ways that maybe are a privileged account. So they may have the ability to be a domain admin, even though they're not in the domain admins group. And that's going to be a real common theme we're going to be talking about here is the ability to have an object do things that it shouldn't because it's not in the right group. Okay, so follow me here. We're going to talk about shadow administrators, specifically with Active Directory attributes. We'll talk about skeleton key attacks and how we can circumvent authentication at the domain controller level. We'll also talk about a SID history attack. This one's really interesting on how we can change personas and roles with something as simple as an AD attribute. And then we'll talk about service accounts and risky SPNs and how something as simple as misconfiguring an object can really open up a lot of risk of a service account. Okay. Then I'll talk about zBang. What we're going to do is we're going to break this up into 2 different halves of this talk. We're going to talk about the risks. We'll introduce the scan. And then after the talk concludes, I'll actually show you the tool and show you the code. So we'll do that afterwards. So we'll have a live demo piece of this. I've obfuscated the data, but this is real live customer data that I'm going to show you of an enterprise organization. But of course, it's obfuscated for everything. All right, so let's get started. Hidden risks. The first one we're going to talk about is the shadow administrator account. If you're familiar with Active Directory, we look at it from a group perspective. That's how we've managed the user objects, the groups of people, the computers. It's all about security groups. So when most organizations are looking for administrative accounts, they look at, the power users, the local admins group, the domain admins group, and that's where we base our reports and our compliance off of, right? Well, maybe you should look some little further deeper because simply put, let's see here. No worries. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Well, I'm not able to progress the slide. There we go. How are we doing on audio? All right, we're doing good on audio. Okay. So back to the talk here. When organizations are looking for the privileged accounts, they look at the security groups. We're often here in this example, those same permissions can be applied exactly to the user instead. So what you have here on the left is a domain admins group that has all those same permissions as Emily here, who has those objects immediately applied directly to them. This is an example where we're going to defeat using somebody like an existing domain admin, a malicious insider. We're going to create a backdoor with a local user. Y'all familiar with Microsoft Laps? It's a great product. I'm absolutely a fan of it. It creates unique passwords for that local admin account. It's a great tool, but it's got some drawbacks to it. And I'll show you right here. This is John Smith. John is logged on. He's a standard user. He's trying to view an extended AD attribute, trying to view the extended attribute of an Exchange server. Well, because this user does not have admin rights to view that, they don't get the answer. They don't get the local admin password. Okay, that's what we expect. All right. So John's got a buddy. Let's call him Frank. Frank decides to run this backdoor from his domain controller or from his domain admin account. And now John Smith here has the access to run the command. So now he runs that same command again and take a look. We can view the extended attribute. You can view that local admin password. So that's kind of why we have to talk about permissions from an object level. We need to be able to know who has access to do what in our Active Directory. Does that make sense? All right. All right. So I mentioned earlier that I don't have all the answers. These guys do. Again, I talked to you that mentioned that this is the shoulders of giants. These are the giants here. Andy Robbins, Will Schroeder, the guys that did Bloodhound, the guys that did PowerShell Empire. These guys are the rock stars. And so again, these are where we need to give credit. They did an amazing talk at Black Hat 2017 called Ace Up the Sleeve. Specifically talked about dynamic access control lists and how those can be abused to create backdoors from an attacker's perspective. So again, look up this information. It's fantastic write-up. All right, so we've talked about the FUD. Let's talk about how we can protect from these sorts of things. From a prevention perspective, I got some bad news. We're kind of hosed. There's not a lot that we can do from a prevention perspective. It's really about monitoring, detecting, and responding. So there's a couple of event IDs that I would recommend an organization tune their event logging to alert on. So event log 4738, a user account was changed, making sure that events change within corresponding policies within your enterprise, right? Replication of metadata, making sure that your AD is actually replicating properly. And trust me when I say that that's also an indicator of other types of attacks that we'll talk about later. So AD replication is important. Also, your system access control lists. These are container entries that specify access attempts and generate audit records in the event of a domain controller. That's the one that you really want to pay attention to. For more information, I've created a bit.ly link, so feel free to take a look at this and dive in deeper into the shadow admin type of risk we're talking about. So now that I can segue to zBang and talk about the ACL Light scan developed by my buddy Asaf. Asaf developed this tool in a way that you can look at your AD and find if there's accounts that may have too many permissions and may have the ability to do something like a DC sync explicitly. So even though it's a regular user in all other contexts, it has the ability to facilitate something as bad as a golden ticket attack. I mean, that's permanent persistence. So this is a scan that, and let me take a step back. zBang in and of itself can be used in a red or blue methodology. So think of it this way. Red teamers can use this to find the vulnerable attacks that they can then exploit. At the same time, organizations can use this in a defensive manner in identifying the weak counts, the weak risks, or the amounts of risk in their organization they can shore up. So I think that there's value in using this tool from a blue and red perspective. Okay, so that's the AC Light scan. I'll show you that later when we wrap up with the PowerPoint. We'll go through all the different ones. So questions so far about shadow admin accounts. Do we have any questions or any comments coming in on the chat for the WebEx, or I'm sorry, the Zoom session? Okay, well, remote attendees, feel free. We're watching, so if you have any questions, feel free to type in. Moving forward, we're going to talk about our next hidden risk and a skeleton key attack. This was discovered in the wild in about 2015 and is still being used in the wild today. What this is it's code running on the domain controllers. So the problem is all this is running on the DC, so there's no network traffic to alert against. So any sort of intrusion prevention is kind of pointless. So what's scary here is once you've got access to the domain controller, you basically have access to everything anyway. So again, this is why this isn't such a huge deal. This is more of about persistence and circumventing of auditing. Okay, so that's the dangerous thing about it. The weak thing about the skeleton key attack is a couple of things. One is the fact that it's deployed in memory, meaning that it's bypassing any sort of like signature-based AV from like a file hash perspective. But because it's running in memory, it lacks persistence. So you reboot the machine, it's not running in code anymore. So that's a good thing and a bad thing. The other thing, and I mentioned earlier about replication, is unfortunately this will break your AD replication. So if you notice any sort of replication failing in your organization, that could be due to a really bad systems administrator, or it could be due to perhaps skeleton key malware, one or the other. I don't know. Another thing is another indicator is the degradation of the functional level in Active Directory. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's the level of encryption. So in more recent versions of Active Directory, the functional level of encryption is set to AES 2048 or 128, 120, 256, one of them. It's AES. Anyway, in the process of a skeleton key attack, the functional level of Active Directory is degraded. So it's now running RC4 instead of AES. Now, there are legitimate times and use cases where running a degraded functional level makes sense. If you've got old systems on your environment, you've migrated up through the years, you may have a portion of your environment that may be running RC4. So again, this is an indicator, but it's not an end-all, 100% specific confirmation. And then lastly, I think I'd mentioned this earlier, the fact that this is running in memory, you reboot, it's gone. So we'll talk about it now. There was yes, wirefall. That's a really great question. So Wirefall was asking in the functional degradation of the encryption and what was the other one? I just forgot. The replication breaking. I don't really know the answer to that, whether or not it's critical for I would assume it would have to be critical for the attack to work. Otherwise, an attacker worth their salt wouldn't allow that to happen, that replication to break, or, so I'm assuming that that's probably how it's circumventing the authentication, is breaking that level of functionality. Honest to God answer, I don't know. So that'll be a great follow-up for me from this presentation, is to get you a specific answer. So stay tuned. All right, so let's continue and show how easy it is to run this skeleton key attack. Mimikatz really has it all. It simply put, once we've got command line access as a domain admin on that domain controller, again, we own basically everything already. So running Mimikatz should be no problem. You push in the skeleton key function, you can basically access anything as any user at that point. So we're specifying Travis over here, and Travis can authenticate even though he doesn't have access. So let's talk about mitigation techniques. This is really about brokering access securely to your critical assets. So making sure that you're brokering access securely to those domain controllers, because that was the problem, was we got somebody that got access to that domain controller. So really it's about going beyond just a single factor of authentication for me. It's got to be multi-factor, two-factor authentication or beyond to access your critical infrastructure. Also, segmentation. Making sure that your critical infrastructure is isolated from a network perspective goes a long way in preventing the ability for an attacker to pivot and laterally move. So a lot of people kind of look at me, their eyes glaze over when we start talking about lateral movement. What exactly is that? Well, What an attacker wants to do when they're breaching an organization is they're going to start small. They're going to get an initial foothold. Then what you want to do is laterally move or pivot and jump, skip, hop over to another machine that may have more access or more permissions or more had juicy information. So it's a matter of reconnaissance, lateral movement. Reconnaissance, lateral movement, to ultimately you have enough permissions to execute your end game. And so that's what these attackers are trying to do. And so again, when we limit the ability for them to laterally hop, skip, and jump from machine to machine, it goes a long way in preventing these sorts of attacks. The other thing is limiting privilege of these sorts of accounts. Just because you have local admin rights doesn't mean you should be able to run every single command a local admin has the ability to do, especially if that's not your job, right? Just because you have local admin rights doesn't mean you should be using them. And so this is very applicable when we talk about critical applications, critical infrastructure, making sure you have some level of ability, so application control that could prevent the execution of something like Mimikatz. So that would be kind of a recommendation I would suggest. Now, zBang, this is a piece. Oh, is there a question? Yes. AppLocker is absolutely a great recommendation. Any sort of least privilege application control is what we're gunning for. So AppLocker is a great suggestion. Yes. Doesn't lateral movement bring network into the picture? Fantastic question, and absolutely right. In two ways. One, we need to set isolation from a network perspective, so network segmentation is important, but also the devices themselves within the network infrastructure. The fact of the matter is most Cisco equipment still has that enable account set up, even though they may be using TACACS. And those are probably the same passwords across the enterprise. So you could use, even though they're local accounts, you could probably guess if it's on one machine that gets popped, it's probably going to be the same on every other machine in the enterprise. So absolutely that level of control from a security perspective needs to apply to network infrastructure just as much as it does to really, in my opinion, anything that correlates to like your DR program should be kind of isolated and protected as such. Make sense? All right. So zBang, I mentioned this earlier. This is the skeleton key scan. What this does is it queries your Active Directory and pulls a list of all the domain controllers and simply checks their RC functional level. That's it. All right. So that's the simple thing. I mentioned earlier that I had a very large government institution that ran this scan and freaked out. They called me panicking, saying, "Andy, oh my God, we're breached." And I'm like, whoa, hold up. Let's take a step back and evaluate the circumstances. And so it looked, upon evaluation, we found about 25% of the domain controllers were infected, in air quotes here. And what in fact happened was that was part of their legacy domain. They were still running at an RC4 functional level. Everything was hunky-dory. The way we validated that is, again, the lacking of persistence. So if this was a skeleton key attack, if we had rebooted the machine, run it again, then it should show healthy and clean, right? So that's exactly what we did. I had them reboot the domain controllers. We reran the scan, and it still showed as functional level RC4 as per the configuration. So even though it showed as infected, it was a false positive. And so, I mean, that just kind of goes to merit and show that, don't take all your, test results as verbatim, but there were good indicators that, they had the opportunity, and they didn't know that they were running at a functional level that they could upgrade to. So even though we didn't address the skeleton key issue, we were still able to improve their security by increasing their awareness of their functional account or functional level. All right, so let's get started. Back to talking about another type of persistence method. This is a concept called SID History Attack. Anybody here familiar with the SID History Attacks? This one's cool. This is, again, done in large enterprise organizations that have done domain migrations, all right? So you've gone from one migration to another. What we're going to do is there's an attribute in Active Directory called SID History, and it honors the SID value of the current SID and whatever's in that SID history value. So in this process, in a good SID history migration, you see this is the old domain, and it gets migrated to the SID history value. And then the new SID comes online. Well, in a SID history attack, what happens is we take the SID of a valid new current domain and mark that as our SID history instead. So what happens is that it honors both of those two properties in the current new domain. So what you can do is take any one of these these privileged syntaxes and put on your mask and basically become this type of user. And if you haven't seen this video, I freaking love it, where the guy chases the cats off. Love it, love it. But that's what essentially we're doing here, is we're creating our own masks by impersonating any one of these roles. And again, Mimikatz makes this super stinking easy. I mean, it's simply done from the command line. In this circumstance here, Boba Fett is going to become an AD admin. We're going to make Boba Fett the Active Directory domain admin. And again, it's simply done in just a couple lines of text. So in this circumstance, we've now added the domain admin as the SID history of the current domain. So now Mr. Boba Fett can harvest the KRBTGT hash of the domain, which is the critical piece of a golden ticket attack. I mean, it's game over for this domain after this. They have to literally blow this thing up because it's toast. We have permanent access on here. So let's talk about detection techniques. It's really about enumerating the values, making sure that you know the SID history values. So if you haven't done a domain migration, if you see anything in the SID history, you probably better look into that. That's really kind of done with some of these PowerShell functions. So just query that. And then also look for SID history values of your current domain in that SID history value. So again, the PowerShell functions are available, and I'll post those online. Also, pay attention to your VIN IDs. Make sure that these sorts of changes to your Active Directory are done in compliance to change management. Making sure that you know what's going on, and making sure you have visibility into that. All right. So again, 4765 and 4766, great VIN IDs to alert from. All right, so here's the zBang scan. Again, I'll go over that shortly, but simply put, it does a graphical representation of all the 80 objects with both a SID and a SID history value so that you can then compare. And again, we'll do that in the demo shortly. All right, let's move forward and talk about SPNs. Anybody know what an SPN is? Service Principal Name. This is a unique identifier with Active Directory. It is cataloging every service running on that server within Active Directory. And so what's interesting here is how it authenticates. And so it uses Kerberos to authenticate in 3 different manners of delegation. We'll talk about that in a second. But what's we're going to talk about right now is the misconfiguration of the Kerberos SPN to either a computer object or a user object. All right. So in this circumstance, a correct configuration for an SPN is to have it bound to a computer object. That password is long, it's complex. The chances of that being brute forced are few and far between. Okay. As compared to a user, if an SPN is configured to a user account, well, that means it's probably been defined by a user, meaning that dictionary attacks, brute force attacks may be applicable here. And so that's what we're going to do because of this is the biggest issue for me is these SPNs are stored in Active Directory, whether or not the server even exists. So this can be, you can have an end-of-life server, but you've never pulled the Active Directory account out of production. Well, that SPN still exists. It can be Kerberosted and it can be brute forced. So I'm going to show you all that right now. And this is where I'll get excited here. So this was all instrumental work of Tim Medine. So I wanted to give Tim credit where credit's due again. So I reached out to him and I said, thank you. Can you include some photos for my presentation today? And so again, his work, Kicking the Guard Dog of Hades, was amazing. It was instrumental. And honest to God, Kerberosting would not exist if it wasn't for Tim. So again, he was, he actually presented at DC 214 last month, if I recall correctly. So great guy and a good member of the community. So again, take a look at his work when we start talking about Kerberosting. So CyberArk Labs developed a PowerShell function that actually scans Active Directory to find those misconfigured SPNs. What you can then do is request the Kerberos ticket for those improperly configured SPNs. Then you can take it out to Hashcat to brute force it, meaning you can basically take these SPNs offline to brute force at your discretion, right? You can do that whole thing in a single command, which I think is kind of cool. So that's what we're kind of talking about as far as improperly configured SPNs. So let's talk about how we can mitigate them. It's kind of common sense to me, but if you have deprecated SPNs, end of life, things that are dead, remove them from Active Directory. It's kind of common sense. The other thing is avoiding dual use accounts. When I say a dual use account, I'm referring to who's authenticating with it. Is it a human user or is it a robot? Is it a service account? And so from a detection perspective, this allows blue teams to respond based on how it's being used. So if I see in a service account that I know is only to be used in a service account manner, and I see it being used as an interactive logon, well, I can maybe alert on that. And so again, if you have an account that is just kind of a generic use account that's being used by service account, sysadmins, whatever, well, you lose that accountability. So again, really try to make sure that if you have a human user using an account, only a human user uses it, okay? Let's talk about encryption. I kind of talked about that regarding the skeleton key attack and the degraded encryption, whatever, it's tongue-tied. So again, alert for that. Be aware that stronger encryption is stronger security. Least privileged approach. I kind of touched on this earlier, making sure that just because a account has the capacity to run an application doesn't mean that it should. And that's really a precursor for an attacker to do reconnaissance. So having that level of application control and least privilege is really kind of a critical control, specifically when we're talking about the keys of our kingdom here. All right, so now we're talking about passwords, the how to broker access to these critical things. I talk about this a lot, so I'll kind of gloss over it, but there's really 3 tenets to a secure password. It's the complexity. We all know what the complexity is for, right? It's to stop brute forcing, okay? So we got a complex password. We've got a unique password. That's the next piece. Why do we want a unique password? Again, it prevents that lateral movement that I talked about earlier. Remember, if the same password's the same on all the network devices, then it doesn't matter if they're, the local account. I can still laterally move. So we want to make sure that every single privileged account is unique. So in the event it's compromised, there's no lateral movement opportunity. I'm on my little island of screwed, basically. So we've talked about frequency of we did not talk about the most important piece, the frequency of rotation. So we talked about unique, complex. Frequency of rotation is often overlooked. This is my story that I like to tell in this that kind of makes my case for me. Let's say that China's got my domain admin hash, all right? So they're throwing every single GPU that they have at it, and they're going to brute force that thing in 1 month. In reality, it'd probably be exponentially shorter than that, but hypothetically, for the sake of our discussion, 1 month. Well, if I have a policy in place that rotates that password every week, by the time that they brute force that one account, it's been changed 4 times. So that's really why I want to really advocate those 3 tenets of a secure password: unique, complex, and frequently changing. All right, so moving forward, making sure that hard-coded credentials, specifically the privileged accounts like domain admin accounts, there really shouldn't be a situation where they're in a hard-coded situation, like scripts in particular. Sysadmins are just guilty of this, like repeatedly, of finding these sorts of privileged accounts in their hard-coded in their credentials. Let's keep moving forward. Monitor usage of privileged accounts. I kind of mentioned this earlier, when we're talking about dual use accounts, monitoring how they're being used. So again, seeing if a service account is being used interactively is one indicator. Another would be frequency of use. So if you have a systems admin that typically logs on Monday through Friday, they typically log on to 3-4 database servers, but they happens to be a Saturday morning, they log in from a unknown IP address and access 34 different database systems. Well, based on certain security policies, that could all be legitimate. There could be a legitimate circumstance where their policies allow for that. She's a database admin and she has access to all those 34 systems. Because it falls outside of heuristic behavior, those are things that you should alert for. There may be legitimate use cases, but as a security organization, you need to be aware when activities fall outside your heuristic footprints, right? Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. No, and Wirefall is making a point about looking at this from the, say it again. So the risky SPN is only looking for that one attribute. And so there are drawbacks to this. This is why this is coming from our labs and R&D team versus as a production polished product. Same thing with the skeleton key scan. Just because it's running RC4 doesn't mean that it's infected. So there are some drawbacks to this. And this is more just to bring attention to the potential of a misconfiguration. So that's kind of why. That's how I'm dancing around the answer. That's the one factor it looks for. Just like the skeleton key only checks for the encryption, the functional level, this only checks for SPNs configured to the user AD attribute. Yes. Can you run those simultaneously at the same time? Not really. You have to kind of do them in process. So how can you pull the SPN? How can you pull the Kerberos ticket of the SPN if you don't know what SPN to pull? So you have to kind of do them in process. And so that's why you do it in the PowerShell function. It does that procedurally for you. So that's why I put it into that one liner. That's why it's so cool, because it's doing all that for you in a single command. All right. So any questions before I continue? Anybody online? Y'all still awake? Are your houses still present? Do you still have roofs, people? All right, let's keep going. Risky SPN. So again, that is the tool. We'll show you in shortly, but simply put, what this pulls is the, again, SPNs discovered in Active Directory that are configured to the user AD object rather than the computer. So again, we'll show you shortly. Now we'll talk about a different type of risk relative to SPNs, and it's how they're delegated. This one's a little confusing, but here's where let me explain. Simply put, an attacker can abuse a service account in a way that really opens up the environment. Because these service accounts are being used quite often on multiple systems, that allows you to be able to use those service accounts on multiple systems. So an attacker really, really likes service accounts because it's a goal. It's a free ride to, you know, lateral movement town, you know? So they are used for privilege escalation, remote code execution. My buddy Matan, Macho Sec on Twitter, he did a whole presentation at Black Hat Asia on this. And I would recommend you take a look at his presentation and his work on these unconstrained SPNs, because it's really surprising. I'm going to kind of read through a lot of this of what an unconstrained and constrained delegation is. But basically, when a domain administrator configures a service account to be unconstrained, it has the ability to be basically any user on that machine. So what that means is that in an insecure delegation option, a service could impersonate any user. Regular user counts, this is where it's okay. I don't mind if we see a scan that shows an unconstrained account. If it's a low privileged account, that's what I want to see. But if it happens to be a privileged account, worse, like a domain admin, which I've seen before, that's where we want to prune those privileges down. In my opinion, no domain admin should ever log on to anything other than a domain controller. Ever, 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 ever. Okay, so constrained delegation. This one is a little different, introduced in 2003. This allows administrator to limit only which services that can do the authentication. It's difficult to configure because each SPN has to be registered to the domain admin rights to implement. So you don't see this very often, but you will see it occasionally. The problem with this is it cannot cross domains or forest boundaries. So that's the drawback with constrained SPNs. So what they did was they introduced resource-based constrained SPNs. This one was introduced in 2012. And what's cool here is it eliminates the need for SPNs to switch descriptors. So domain admin can implement and allowed server admins of backend services to control which service principals request Kerberos tickets for any other user. So basically, it's handing off the authentication. process to another service, make a more secure service too. So it's simply delegating the authentication to another service. That's the more secure wet method, and that's the best practice that we really want to see. So that's what we're hoping to find when we run our next scan. This is Mystique, and we couldn't have a Mystique scan without having a Mystique as our logo here. And so this discovers improperly configured, risky Kerberos delegations. And so we've got this as a standalone scan, but this is, again, rolled up into the entire zBang product. So a little bit more about zBang. Again, this was developed by our R&D guys. This is our CyberArk Labs folks. They're creating some really cool stuff, and it's free. We're not trying to sell this stuff. We're just trying to give it away because we really see the value. I don't care if you buy the product. I just want you to run this and shore up your environments. Again, this can be used from a red team perspective just as much as it could be from a blue team. It also doesn't have any sort of license requirements, so there's no phoning home. Your data is your own. All right. What I like about this also is this is only done using a read-only account. It takes about 7 to 10 minutes to run. It only queries your domain controllers, so it's not invasive. It is very lightweight, and you can get a ton of information in a short amount of time. As far as system requirements, PowerShell v3 and .NET 4.5, basic stuff. You know, this is the built-in software stuff. Just like Blanche, it's super easy. By the way, have any of you rewatched Golden Girls recently? I watched this as a kid, and I didn't realize how much went over my head. That show is dirty. It really is. Oh my gosh. So yeah, just like Blanche here, zBang is super easy to run in an environment. So I would highly recommend you give it a go. That is my piece for today. I'm going to open up the floor to a couple of questions before I continue to show you the actual product. So any questions here in the room today? Yes. Uh-huh. No, that's what it is. It's that we're talking about. So good call out. Any questions on the line? Can you get a copy of the PowerPoint? Absolutely. I will update the meetup URL with a copy of the SlideShare URL with a copy of this deck. So if you want to get a copy of zBang to run in your environment, again, it's free of charge. It's available up on GitHub. You have free access to the source code. Have a crack at it. And absolutely, I'll put the link up as well. So feel free to download this today. And if you have any questions as far as like needing to digest the data, just give me a call. That's what I love, doing that sort of stuff. So again, in summary today, we introduced the hidden risks of shadow admins, skeleton key attacks, improperly configured SPNs, and SID history attacks. And hopefully zBang can be a powerful tool that you can use to protect this organization of yours. So that concludes at least my presentation piece. So I'm going to now kind of switch over, have a seat, and show you the zBang tool. All right. So let's see. This is zBang. Where are we at as far as screen share? All right. So I can't see the projector, but are we good on the WebEx? All right. Let me try projecting 1 second. Duplicate. There we go. All right, we good here? Y'all can see the screen? Okay. So this is zBang. This is the ACL Lite scan initially. This is live, real, like Fortune 500 data, but again, I've scrubbed it so you can't see who this actually belongs to. But we're going to take a look at the il.rome domain. And you can see here's just a handful of privileged accounts. Here's a regular account here. You can see all their permissions from a visual perspective. You can see certain privileged activities, but let's take a look at this one over here, this ZXY. It flags this one as a potential shadow admin account because it has some level of property that we've previously defined as having potential risk. In this circumstance, this one has access to run DC sync. So even though it's a standard user, it has the ability to do something that only a domain admin has the ability to do. So if you're looking for domain admins in the domain admin group in an attempt to try to protect your organization, well, unless you're looking for this, ZXY is going to be completely under the radar. So this is why we want to run ACL Lite. Questions? All right, let's move forward and show you the skeleton key scan. Now remember, this is very simple. All we're doing is polling the domain controllers and checking their functional levels. So in this circumstance, only one domain controller was infected. I think in future versions, I think we should probably denote the fact that it's just been degraded and not quote unquote infected. So any sort of like feedback that you guys have on this, let me know, because I, again, have a direct line of communication to the people that are developing this. And so any improvements you want to see improved on this, let me know and we'll take it straight to the horse's mouth. All right, so that is the skeleton key scan. We're going to move forward. We're going to move to SID history. Now, this is a very, yeah, what's the question? So we're looking for Active Directory risk. So the answer is it works within Active Directory. So if you've got any sort of bridged AD objects within your Linux and Unix environment, potentially you could have some visibility into that. But specifically, this is more tailored towards Windows and Active Directory environments. Oh, where you can run the tool? So it runs with PowerShell. So we would need PowerShell. A good point. So I'm trying to skate the answer, but the answer is Windows only. Okay. So yeah, you called me out. All right. So here we go with the SID history. This is a very small scan. We only got 2 SIDs to review. There's me at Rome here. And you can see I've got 2 SID values. There's me at my new domain and one with my old domain. So that's the SID history value, is the old domain. That's what we want to see. Now we've got Phineas over here. Phineas has got an interesting circumstance. Phineas's SID history value happens to be the domain admin value of our current domain. That is a legitimate attacker in our midst. And anybody know who Phineas happens to be? Phineas Fisher happens to be a illicit black hat hacker. He was the one that took out the Italian hacking team. These were a legitimate company that was creating malicious invasive software for invasive regimes like Syria and North Korea. He didn't take too kindly to that. And he wrote a write-up of this attack, and it's fantastic. I mean, the initial breach was done with a 0-day on some networking infrastructure, but the way he pivoted through an organization, just living off the land, and who he targeted was really interesting, and like focusing on the people with privilege, like database admins, application developers, sysadmins. I mean, these are the people that have all the keys to the kingdom by default, right? So those are the people that attacker is going to target. So again, Phineas's write-up is amazing. So I highly recommend you give it a read. Not really. Why is it allowed? That's a great question. I'm sure there's got to be a reason. I don't know off the top of my head. Maybe a dual use account. But at this point, I'm spitballing. I can't think of a legitimate reason. I'm sure somebody on the line might. So we'll see. Read only. There's no special privilege on AD. All we're doing is querying the domain controller. So read only account, no elevated privilege needed. Correct. Yes. Because of the fact this is done with a read-only account, no edits are made to your environment. Absolutely. Yeah. So exactly. If you're getting any sort of like pushback from your organization, say, hey, look, this is a read-only account. I mean, there's no harm, no foul here. Another tool, I mean, this is a talk about zBang, but I want to also introduce another tool that I think is really, really valuable in understanding your Active Directory environment. And it's a tool called Goldfinger. And this, again, queries your Active Directory for certain types of privileged accounts based on certain flags. So you can find certain help desk permissions and things like that. So between zBang and Goldfinger, I think these are really good tools to get a lock of your Active Directory environment. All right, so we've showed off the SID history. Let's take a look at the risky SPNs. We've got 3 domains here. We're going to take a look at let's take a look at the US here. Take a look, and you can see we've got a couple of SPNs here that are configured to users. So there is a quick alignment of the server host, the service SPN, and the user account that it's affiliated to. So quick, easy from an attacker's perspective to know which accounts to focus on, right? And again, from a blue team perspective, these are the accounts we need to shore up. All right, so let's move forward and take a look at the other SPN configuration we're talking about, the delegation and the Mystique scan. With Mystique, we've got a few more colors here, and it's really kind of delineating between the different types of constraints. So the unconstrained is here in red, these service accounts. And again, this account can run this can run any service. We have our more constrained version here delineated by this service account. And then we have 2 types of protocol transition or delegated accounts. And so that's really what we want to see. And to be perfectly honest, you don't see a lot of those in production AD environments. You want to see that, but we see a lot more constrained and unconstrained in production environments. So that concludes the zBang live demo. Is there anything you guys want to see before I wrap this up for today? So actually, I wasn't planning on showing you what the actual exports look like, but here's what it is. It compiles everything into a zip file. Upon looking into it, you can look at the XML files and look at the files that are built from it. But that's actually how I scrub the data. But really, you don't even have to go this deep. You can, upon running the scan, it saves the results so you can pull it up for review later. And so, yeah, just pull up the zip file and it brings up it in a graphical interface. No, at this point in time, this does not compare deltas, but because of the fact that it's built out in this manner, we can extract the files and do our deltas from a more programmatic approach if you wanted to, but I would probably prefer a root canal. So, all right. Well, that really kind of concludes my presentation today on zBang and the hidden risks in Active Directory. Again, these are the risks that really require that initial persistence. So I'm not talking about, the attackers from outside. These are the attackers that have already got a hold in your organization, whether that be they're an APT or they may be just a disgruntled guy down the hall from you. So again, these are sorts of things that you need to be aware of. Alert on those and respond. And so hopefully a tool like zBang or Goldfinger, or even just those alerting on those alert codes that I gave, those sorts of things are controls that you can do to protect your organization. So that concludes what I got. Thanks so much, guys. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to pass this back to Philip. Thank you again.
Thanks again, Andy. Thanks for coming out. So everyone give him a big round of applause. And thanks for everyone that joined online.